They called him the Voice. They saw the pristine tuxedo, the glass of Jack Daniels, and the arrogant smile of a king. But that was just the mask. Look closer. Behind those old blue eyes that once made America kneel, there was no romance. There was an abyss, a soul rotting from violence, a paralyzing fear of abandonment, and the rage of a man perpetually at war with himself. Frank Sinatra didn't sing to entertain. He sang to keep himself from falling into hell. He lived his way, yes, but the price of that way was a mournful symphony, where every crescendo was written in blood, betrayal, and absolute loneliness. This story doesn't begin under the stage lights. It begins in a cramped house in Hoboken, 1915, with a dead child, or so they thought. Twist 1. Fate marked Frank with agony from the very first second. A brutal birth. The doctor's forceps crushed the baby's face, ripping through the neck and ear. Blood soaked the sheets. Believing the infant was stillborn, the doctor tossed the limp purple body onto a cold counter to save the bleeding mother. If his grandmother hadn't instinctively splashed freezing water onto that corpse, the world would never have known Frank Sinatra. His first sound wasn't a breath of life. It was a scream of pure pain. The scars running down his cheek and a punctured eardrum were not just injuries, they were a curse. A mark that said, "This boy will walk the thin line between life and death for eternity." People often ask, where did the coldness in Frank's eyes come from? The answer lies with the woman who birthed him, Dolly Sinatra. Dolly was not a nurturing mother. She was the uncrowned godfather of their Hoboken block. She ruled her household with a fist and terror. Frank didn't grow up with lullabies. He grew up with shouting matches. A defining memory. Frank beaten savagely by his mother simply for spilling a bowl of rice. In Frank's world, love was always accompanied by punishment. Dolly taught her son his first lesson in behavioral psychology. Never show weakness. Emotion is a luxury you cannot afford. At school, the other kids called him Scarface. Frank didn't cry. He didn't fight back, not yet. He just stared at them with eyes so piercingly blue, so devoid of warmth that they had to look away. That was the birth of a twisted persona. A lonely boy starving for affection, yet programmed to react with violence. At 23, Frank was arrested for a jealous brawl. The charges were dropped, but the incident branded a second brutal lesson onto his psyche, one harder than his mother's beatings. Once your name is in the papers, you are no longer human. You are a commodity. In 1939, Frank stepped into the music world not to be famous, but simply to be heard. But a voice needs a platform, and the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, the most prestigious band of the era, gave him that stage. Frank became a phenomenon. By 1944, at the Paramount Theater, 35,000 people rioted in the streets of New York. Women fainted, men seethed with jealousy. The press called it Sinatramania. For the first time in history, a human voice became a weapon of mass hysteria. But Tommy Dorsey was a greedy master. The contract he forced Frank to sign was slavery, swallowing almost every cent Frank earned. Frank wanted out. He was suffocating. But how do you escape a shark? Twist 2. The answer lay in whispers that were never proven, yet everyone understood: the mafia. In 1942, Frank severed ties with Dorsey. The newspapers buzzed with the rumor that his Italian friends from the shadows had put a gun to Dorsey's head, forcing him to sign the release. Frank Sinatra went from a beloved singer to a traitor in the eyes of the industry, a godfather's pet. The door to freedom opened, but Frank had stepped into a darker room. He stood alone, arrogant but isolated. He learned a chilling truth. To stand at the summit, sometimes you have to sell your soul to the devil. No king rules forever. By the late 1942, Frank's empire collapsed so fast it was dizzying. Fate's punishment was relentless. Columbia Records dropped him. The public grew bored. And then, the ultimate horror, he lost his voice. In 1952, a severe vocal hemorrhage left the voice raspy, weak, sounding like the dying breath of a sick man. Psychological decay. From the height of fame, Frank became unemployed, buried in debt. His marriage crumbled. Friends stopped calling. He wandered the cold streets, staring at old, peeling posters of his former self. In a dingy apartment, Frank Sinatra, the man who once had America at his feet, stared blankly at the gas oven. Suicide wasn't just a thought, it was a plan. Death seemed the only exit for an ego that had been crushed into the mud. Twist 3. But right at rock bottom, the monster inside him woke up. The role of Angelo Maggio in From Here to Eternity, 1953, wasn't acting. It was an exorcism. Frank wasn't playing a soldier. He was playing his own life. A reckless, beaten, abandoned man who refused to kneel. The Oscar he won wasn't just a comeback. It was a resurrection from the ashes. When he signed with Capitol Records, the sweet velvet voice of the past was dead. In its place was a new sound, deeper, scarred, smelling of whiskey and smoke. He no longer sang about dreams. He sang about loss. And the world, once again, fell at his feet. If Frank's life was a psychological thriller, the women were the most painful chapters. Nancy Barbato, the abandoned anchor. Nancy was the only stability he ever knew. She washed his shirts, gave him coins when he was nobody. She was the mother of his children, his safety. But Frank, driven by a wild, self-destructive nature, trampled on that peace. He betrayed her publicly. Nancy chose silence, a silence so painful it was deafening, keeping the name Sinatra until her death as a vow of eternal loyalty. Ava Gardner, the destructive fire. If Nancy was water, Ava Gardner was gasoline. This is the biggest twist of his emotional life. He left his wife and children to chase Ava, the goddess of Hollywood, the only woman who possessed the same mad blood as him. They loved like wild animals, breaking furniture, screaming matches, jealous rages, followed by desperate lovemaking. Ava was the only person who dared to throw Frank Sinatra out on the street, and Frank was the man pathetic enough to fly across continents just to see her for 10 minutes. Twist 4. Ava Gardner was Frank's karma. She destroyed his reputation. She made the church and the public despise him. But in a cruel irony, the pain Ava inflicted made Frank a true artist. The album, In the Wee Small Hours, isn't music. It is the weeping of a man whose heart has been ground to dust by a woman. Frank loved the only person capable of killing him emotionally. When Ava died years later, Frank wept like the child he once was in Hoboken. He realized he had traded the one who loved him most, Nancy, for the one he loved most, Ava, and in the end, he lost them both. The 1,960 seconds. Frank stood at the head of the Rat Pack, a gang of men in tuxedos, drinking whiskey like water, mocking every rule. They were the symbol of masculine power. But political power was what Frank truly craved. He poured his soul into supporting John F. Kennedy. He used his influence, his money. He thought he was the president's friend. Twist 5. The betrayal of power. The moment JFK entered the White House, he cut Frank loose. The rumors of Frank's mafia ties were too toxic. Frank was discarded like a pawn. The stab in the back from the most powerful man on earth haunted Frank's pride forever. But the tragedy wasn't over. In 1963, his son, Frank Sinatra Jr., was kidnapped. Imagine the chairman of the board, the man who feared nothing, now reduced to a trembling mess by a telephone. For 3 days of hell, Frank sat by the phone, terrified, ready to pay any price. When his son was finally rescued, Frank collapsed. That fear changed his wiring forever. From that day on, he carried a roll of dimes in his pocket to use a payphone in case of emergency, a habit born of trauma that he carried to his grave. In his final years, Frank Sinatra faced the only enemy he couldn't punch or bribe: time and dementia. His memory began to disintegrate. On stage, the voice forgot the lyrics. His eyes would dart frantically to the teleprompters, searching for the words that used to live in his soul. The audience applauded not because he was good, but because they were witnessing a monument crumbling in real time, fighting desperately to stay standing. His final words on his deathbed in 1998 were short but devastatingly heavy. "I'm losing." The man who spent a lifetime winning, the man who declared "I did it my way," finally had to admit defeat to the darkness. The final twist, the aftertaste. In his coffin, they placed his final possessions: a bottle of Jack Daniels, a pack of Camel cigarettes, a Zippo lighter, and a roll of dimes. Why the coins? It was the trauma of the kidnapping. Even crossing over to the other side, Frank carried the fear of a father, the fear of being unable to call for help, the fear of silence. Narrator voice, fading into the darkness. Frank Sinatra was no saint. He was a magnificent sinner. He lived a brutal life, loved destructively, and paid for it with absolute solitude. His voice is immortal not because it was perfect, but because it carried the scars we all try to hide. When you hear "My Way," don't listen to the triumphant melody. Listen to the sigh of a man who lost everything, just to keep himself.